The handshake that never happened. The door that slams shut on 70 years of friendship. January 2026. A German politician walks into the White House expecting friendly talks and walks out ignored. This isn't about hurt feelings or missed meetings. This is about the exact moment the old world order died in a hallway and J.D. Vance held a knife. What you're about to hear is the story of how one man's pride caused a huge problem that would leave Germany alone, America confident, and the friendship between continents falling apart on the marble floors of power. The person who thought he was always right met the person who was realistic, and only one of them walked away. Lars Klingbeil thought he was untouchable. The General Secretary of the SPD, Germany's ruling Social Democratic Party, Abe had spent years being really good at acting morally superior. He spoke using words like European values, democratic friendship, and the sacred bonds of the after-war friendship. But in January 2026, as he got on that plane to Washington, he wasn't flying as a diplomat, he was flying as a missionary, believing that his speech could save the confused Americans from themselves. The destination was the White House. The target was Vice President J.D. Vance. The weapon was a lecture on reliability, partnership, and the dangers of American nationalism. It was a plan built on the belief that Washington still cared what Berlin thought. That belief was about to explode in his face. The Trump-Vance administration had changed American foreign policy into something the European leaders couldn't recognize. Gone were the days of patient friendship management and carefully chosen words. This was transactional diplomacy in its rawest form. You bring value or you bring nothing. Germany, in the eyes of the new American leadership, had been bringing nothing but complaints for years. Underfunded military, dependence on Russian energy that had fueled Putin's war machine, lectures about human rights while doing business with harsh governments, and now Klingbeil was arriving to deliver another sermon. The pride was staggering. In the days leading up to his Washington trip, Klingbeil had been busy making headlines across German media. He questioned American reliability as a security partner. He suggested that Germany needed to chart its own course independent of what he called the unpredictable Trump-Vance doctrine. He criticized the administration's interest in Greenland as neocolonial ambition. He positioned himself as the voice of reason in a world gone mad with nationalism. To the German press, he was a hero standing up to American bullying. To the Americans reading those quotes in the West Wing, he was an ungrateful ally biting the hand that had protected Europe for 8 decades. Vance's team collected every quote, every interview, every passive-aggressive statement Klingbeil had made about the administration. They built a file and they waited. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. High-level discussions on transatlantic security, trade relations, and the future of NATO. Standard diplomatic theater, except this time there would be no theater. Just minutes before Klingbeil was set to enter the West Wing, Vance's chief of staff walked into the vice president's office with the file. Fresh quotes from that morning. Klingbeil had given an interview to a German newspaper calling the administration's foreign policy dangerous and suggesting that Europe could no longer trust American judgment. The quotes had been published just hours before his scheduled White House meeting. The boldness was breathtaking. Here was a man about to ask for American attention and partnership while at the same time trashing that same America to his home audience. It was the kind of two-faced diplomacy that had defined European-American relations for years. But this administration wasn't playing that game anymore. Vance read the quotes. His face, already known for its calculated intensity, hardened into something colder. Or he looked at his chief of staff and said 3 words that would echo across the Atlantic. Cancel the meeting, no explanation needed. No diplomatic cover story about scheduling conflicts or urgent matters. Just a cancellation. Pure, direct, brutal. When Klingbeil arrived at the White House gates, he was met not by handlers eager to escort him to power, but by mid-level staffers with bad news. The vice president would not be meeting with him. There was no reschedule offered, no alternative proposed. The door was closed. Klingbeil stood there in the cold January air of Washington, D.C. and felt the ground shift beneath his feet. This wasn't how diplomacy worked. You didn't just cancel on a visiting official from a major ally. There were protocols, procedures, ways to manage disagreements without public humiliation. But that was the old world talking. In the new world of 2026, respect was earned, not assumed, and Germany, in the eyes of this administration, had been spending its respect like a trust fund kid burning through inheritance. Klingbeil's team scrambled. They reached out to other officials trying to salvage something from the trip, but the message had already spread through the halls of power like wildfire. Vance doesn't want to see him. In Washington's brutal hierarchy of access, that was a death sentence. If the vice president won't meet with you, nobody else will risk the association. Klingbeil was radioactive. Hours passed. The German delegation, used to red carpet treatment in the capital of their most important ally, found themselves wandering the corridors of irrelevance. No meetings materialized. No photo opportunities emerged. The trip, planned as a demonstration of German diplomatic weight, had become a demonstration of German diplomatic incompetence. And the world was watching. The cameras were waiting outside. International press, German media, American networks, all positioned like vultures, sensing blood in the water. This was the moment when a seasoned diplomat would retreat with dignity, issue a bland statement about productive, informal discussions, and save face for another day. But Lars Klingbeil was not a seasoned diplomat. He was a politician drunk on moral certainty, and he was about to make the worst decision of his career. Instead of cutting his losses and boarding the next flight back to Berlin, Klingbeil walked directly into the press scrum and doubled down. He criticized the administration for what he called a breakdown in diplomatic norms. He suggested that the cancellation proved his point about American unreliability. He positioned himself as the victim of Trumpian rudeness, the reasonable European trying to build bridges while the Americans burned them. To his team, he probably thought he was showing strength, refusing to be intimidated by American power politics. But to everyone watching from Washington, he looked like a man who had learned absolutely nothing from his humiliation. The vice president had just delivered the most public rejection possible, and Klingbeil's response was to complain about it to reporters. It was diplomatic suicide dressed up as moral courage. Back in the West Wing, Vance watched the press conference on a monitor. His expression showed nothing, but those in the room later described an atmosphere of grim satisfaction. The message had been sent. The message had been received, and now the messenger was confirming everything the administration believed about European leadership. Self-righteous, disconnected from reality, and completely convinced that their moral posturing mattered more than actual power. The fallout was immediate and devastating. German opposition politicians seized on the incident as proof of the SPD's failed foreign policy. How could you lecture America about reliability, they asked, when you can't even secure a meeting with the vice president? Conservative media in Germany, long critical of Klingbeil's confrontational approach to the Trump-Vance administration, had a field day. This wasn't diplomacy, they argued. This was ego masquerading as principle, but the real damage was happening behind closed doors in capitals across Europe. French diplomats were already frustrated with German leadership on Ukraine and energy policy, saw the Klingbeil disaster as confirmation that Berlin had lost its way. British officials, navigating their own complex relationship with Washington post-Brexit, quietly distanced themselves from any association with the German approach. Polish leaders, who had long accused Germany of being soft on Russia and China, viewed the incident as poetic justice. The country that had lectured everyone else about European solidarity was now isolated by its own arrogance. And in Washington, the machinery of American power was already moving to the next phase. If Germany's official government was going to be hostile, then America would simply work around them. The Trump-Vance administration began reaching out to German opposition figures, particularly those in the CDU and the rising Alternative for Deutschland. The message was clear: we will work with Germans who share our values, but we will not waste time on those who treat us as the enemy while expecting our protection. This was unprecedented in post-war transatlantic relations. American administrations had always worked with whoever was in power in Allied capitals regardless of political differences. But this administration operated by different rules. Loyalty mattered, results mattered, respect mattered. And Klingbeil had demonstrated none of those things. The German press tried to spin the story as American aggression, but the narrative was slipping away from them. Too many Germans had watched Klingbeil's press conference and thought the same thing. Why would you insult someone and then expect them to meet with you? Yet the logic was inescapable even to those who despised Trump and Vance. Klingbeil had overplayed his hand, and he had done it in the most public way possible. Within 48 hours of the cancellation, the story had evolved beyond a simple diplomatic snub. It had become a symbol of everything wrong with European leadership in the eyes of the new American right. Out-of-touch elites who believed their moral authority exempted them from the normal rules of international relations. Politicians who spent decades under the American security umbrella while simultaneously undermining and criticizing their protector. A class of leaders who had convinced themselves that the world owed them respect simply because they occupied positions of power in important countries. Now, Vance himself addressed the incident indirectly during a speech on American foreign policy. He never mentioned Klingbeil by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. "We will engage with partners who come to the table in good faith," he said, "but we will not tolerate those who speak out of both sides of their mouth, praising cooperation in private while attacking us in public. The era of consequence-free criticism is over." The applause from the American audience was thunderous, but the real message was traveling across the Atlantic at the speed of a retweet. The German political establishment was no longer dealing with a diplomatic hiccup. They were dealing with a fundamental rupture in the transatlantic relationship, and the architect of that rupture was their own General Secretary. But the Klingbeil disaster was only the opening act in a much larger drama that was about to unfold. While the humiliated SPD politician was nursing his wounds back in Berlin, his party was preparing to launch an even more catastrophic confrontation with American power. This time, the battlefield wouldn't be the halls of the White House, it would be the living rooms of every German household. The target would be the crown jewels of American cultural dominance: Netflix, Disney+, Amazon Prime, and every other streaming platform that had become as essential to modern life as electricity and running water. What the SPD was about to attempt would make the Klingbeil snub look like a minor diplomatic disagreement. They were about to declare economic war on American technology, and they were doing it at the worst possible moment. The German economy in early 2026 was circling the drain. Years of disastrous energy policy had left German industry paying some of the highest electricity costs in the developed world. The decision to shut down nuclear power and become dependent on Russian gas had proven to be a strategic catastrophe of historic proportions. Manufacturing, the backbone of German prosperity, was hemorrhaging jobs as companies relocated to countries with cheaper energy and less regulation. The automotive sector, once the pride of German engineering, was being crushed between Chinese electric vehicle competition and American tariff threats. Government debt was climbing, tax revenues were falling, and the political class, rather than addressing these fundamental problems, decided to pick a fight with Silicon Valley. That the legislation was called the Streaming Investment Mandate, a bureaucratic title that disguised its revolutionary intent. On paper, it was about protecting German culture and ensuring that American platforms contributed to local content production. In reality, it was a shakedown. The law would require every streaming service operating in Germany to hand over a massive percentage of their German revenue directly to state-controlled cultural funds, not as a tax that went into general government coffers, but as a mandatory investment that would be spent according to government dictates on content that aligned with approved political and social values. The initial proposal from Culture Minister Claudia Roth had suggested a voluntary approach. The major streaming platforms had already committed 1.8 billion euros to German content production over several years. It was a substantial investment, proof that these companies understood the importance of local markets and were willing to adapt their offerings accordingly. But for the hardliners in the SPD, led by Klingbeil and his allies, 1.8 billion was an insult. They demanded 3.4 billion euros, nearly double the voluntary commitment, and they wanted it extracted by force of law. The justification was cultural sovereignty, but everyone understood the real motivation. The German government was broke and they were looking for someone to rob. American tech companies with their massive market capitalizations and global reach looked like the perfect target. To the Trump-Vance administration, this wasn't cultural policy. When it was extortion wrapped in the language of progressive values, it was a direct assault on American intellectual property and a blatant attempt to force private companies to fund government propaganda. The rhetoric from Washington escalated rapidly. The U.S. Embassy in Berlin sent a formal diplomatic protest directly to Klingbeil's office. The language was unusually blunt for official correspondence. The memo described the proposed law as digital protectionism, reminiscent of authoritarian command economies. It warned that such measures would be viewed as a hostile act against American economic interests. It suggested that Germany was abandoning the principles of free market capitalism that had underpinned the post-war economic order. And it made clear that there would be consequences if the legislation moved forward. But Berlin, still reeling from the embarrassment of the White House snub and eager to demonstrate strength to a domestic audience, refused to back down. Klingbeil saw the streaming fight as his chance at redemption. If Washington wouldn't respect him as a diplomatic partner, he would force them to respect him as an adversary. He began pushing for even more aggressive provisions in the legislation. Mandatory diversity quotas that would require streaming platforms to feature specific percentages of characters from designated minority groups in their content. Compliance audits that would give German bureaucrats the power to review scripts and storylines before they could be streamed to German audiences. Content restrictions that would effectively turn American streaming services into extensions of the German public broadcasting system, complete with the same ideological constraints and political oversight. The American streaming companies watched this legislative assault with a mixture of disbelief and cold calculation. These were not companies accustomed to being pushed around by mid-sized European governments. Netflix had a market capitalization larger than the entire German media industry combined. Disney-owned intellectual property portfolios worth hundreds of billions. Amazon could absorb losses that would bankrupt entire German state broadcasters without blinking. The question wasn't whether they could afford to fight back. The question was what form that fight would take. Behind closed doors, emergency meetings were convened in Los Angeles, Seattle, and Burbank. Legal teams analyzed the proposed German legislation line by line through searching for vulnerabilities and constructing response strategies. Finance departments ran scenarios modeling the impact of various countermeasures. Government relations specialists reached out to their contacts in the Trump-Vance administration, coordinating a unified response to what everyone now recognized as an existential threat to American digital dominance in Europe. 3 scenarios emerged from these war room sessions, each more devastating than the last for the average German consumer. The first option was simple absorption and pass-through. The streaming companies would accept the German extortion, pay the 3.4 billion euros, and immediately raise subscription prices to cover the cost. German Netflix subscribers paying 9 euros per month would wake up to bills demanding 18 euros or 20 euros. Disney Plus would double its fees overnight. The Amazon Prime would become a luxury service accessible only to the wealthy. Every German household that had come to rely on streaming entertainment as an affordable escape from economic anxiety would suddenly find themselves priced out of the market. The second option was more dramatic but equally plausible: total withdrawal from the German market. Rather than submit to government control over content and hand over billions in what they considered protection money, the platforms could simply pull the plug. No more binge watching to decompress after work, just a void where their entertainment had been and a government to blame for taking it away. The third scenario was the nuclear option, and it was the one that terrified German business leaders the most. Total trade war between the United States and Germany, wars with streaming services as merely the opening salvo. President Trump had already made clear during his campaign and his first term that he viewed German trade practices, particularly in the automotive sector, as fundamentally unfair to American workers. The massive trade surplus Germany ran with the United States had been a constant source of irritation. Now, with his own vice president publicly humiliated by a German politician and American companies under legislative assault, Trump had the perfect justification for the tariffs he had always wanted to impose. The math was terrifying in its simplicity. For every euro that Klingbeil extracted from Netflix, Trump could impose 10 euros worth of tariffs on Mercedes, BMW, Volkswagen, and Porsche. The German automotive industry, already struggling with the transition to electric vehicles and Chinese competition, would be crushed. Hundreds of thousands of jobs would disappear. The economic engine that had powered German prosperity for generations would seize up and die. And it would all be traceable back to one man's arrogance and one party's ideological obsession with controlling American technology. German industry associations began sounding alarm bells. The Federation of German Industries issued warnings about the catastrophic economic consequences of antagonizing the United States. Automotive executives privately begged the government to abandon the streaming legislation before it triggered retaliation that would destroy their sector. Even some SPD politicians, those with districts heavily dependent on export industries, started expressing quiet reservations about the wisdom of Klingbeil's confrontational approach. But the party leadership had painted themselves into a corner. After the humiliation in Washington, backing down on the streaming fight would look like weakness compounded by cowardice. Klingbeil and his allies convinced themselves that they were fighting for principle, for cultural sovereignty, for the right of democratic governments to regulate powerful corporations. In reality, they were fighting for their own political survival, and they were willing to gamble the economic future of their entire country on a bet that America would blink first. America was not going to blink. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent met with German Finance Minister Christian Lindner and delivered a message of crystalline clarity. Or the United States viewed the streaming legislation as economic warfare. If it passed, there would be immediate and proportionate retaliation. Tariffs on German goods were already drafted and ready for presidential signature. The transatlantic investment relationship would be fundamentally reassessed. American companies would be advised to reconsider their exposure to German regulatory risk. The message was clear, but so was the subtext. This administration would not tolerate European governments shaking down American companies, and it would use every tool of economic statecraft to defend American interests. The fuse was lit and Berlin was holding the match. What started as one man's failed diplomatic mission had metastasized into an existential crisis for the German economy and the transatlantic partnership. Yet Lars Klingbeil walked into the White House thinking he could lecture America into submission. He walked out a ghost, stripped of influence, respect, and relevance. But instead of learning the lesson, instead of recognizing that the world had changed and that moral posturing was no longer a substitute for actual power, he doubled down. He dragged his party and his country into a war they couldn't win against an opponent they couldn't afford to lose. The streaming fight wasn't about culture or sovereignty. It was about a failing political class desperately trying to extract resources from someone, anyone, to prop up a system collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. And when they chose to extract those resources from American companies, they triggered a response that would reshape the global order. J.D. Vance didn't just remove Klingbeil from the team, he removed Germany from the equation. The door that slammed shut in January 2026 wasn't just the entrance to a meeting room, it was the door to an era when European leaders could criticize, undermine, and lecture the United States while still expecting protection, partnership, and patience. That era died in a White House hallway, and no amount of moral superiority could bring it back. The world of 2026 belongs to those who understand that power respects power and nothing else. Klingbeil learned that lesson the hardest way possible.